And so what happened then in 2019 was that we were told essentially that that instead of advising us to be careful, to be responsible in our social behavior, and to take appropriate medication, we were ordered to stay inside our home. We were ordered, with the threat of police intervention, not to have guests in our homes. And we were ordered, with the threat of job loss or fines, or the inability to travel, to take a vaccine, to inject medication of sorts into our arm, into our body. And this is a dramatic difference. So this level of control over individual choice is completely unethical, and it's also very short-sighted, because medicine is incredibly complex, and treating people for illness and preventing illness is not a one-size-fits-all endeavor.
So, David Thunder, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you for accepting our invitation. You are a university lecturer and a researcher in moral, political, and social philosophy. You're currently a permanent research fellow at the Institute for Culture and Society in the Navarra University in Pamplona, Spain. You have a presence on Substack, YouTube, several other platforms as well. And all of your work is linked on your website, www.davidthunder.com. And you also recently became a father, so congratulations.
Thank you very much.
Was it the first time?
Yes, first time father, yeah.
Unforgettable moments.
Yes, a little girl. Her name is Clara.
Congratulations again. I will never forget the moment my daughter was born, so I guess it will be the same for you.
For sure.
Those are strong memories.
Yes, yeah.
What else would you want our viewers to know about you?
Well, I mean, I could say that I have a passion for freedom, and all of my research and all of my media engagement has something to do with human freedom. You know, all of it has to do with what it means to live as a free human being, and for me, freedom and flourishing or well-being are intimately connected. You cannot live a flourishing life as a human being unless you are free. And freedom without living a flourishing life is also quite empty. I mean, if you spend your time picking blades of grass, technically you might be free, but that's not the fullest expression of human freedom. Yeah, so that's my passion, and that's what I devote myself to in my research.
Which is why your blog is called the Freedom Blog.
Exactly.
Makes sense. I'm very much a lover of freedom myself, so I can't wait to hear what your insights will be about what we are all experiencing right now. You wrote on many different topics in the past 2 years regarding the pandemic and whatever happened around the pandemic. And it was not easy for me to pick a starting point. The one I finally decided to choose is one of your blog posts and also a short video back in January this year, which really made a strong impression on me. You wrote a Substack post entitled, "Are Western Democracies on the Brink of Regime Change?" And I want to quote from it, "Unless we see a major course correction,
we are heading in the direction of a new type of regime characterized by a much more intrusive style of governance, a more far-reaching surveillance and police state, and a more half-hearted utilitarian attitude to civil rights."
To me, this was an eye-opener because I could feel, as I guess many others did, that something was going on, something that was different from what used to be happening, and definitely something was going wrong in our Western liberal democracies. But I could not pinpoint exactly what it was. There were just a few scattered observations here and there. And you really put precise words on what was just an overall bad feeling for me. You outlined 5 different components, and maybe you will add another one, I don't know, as things are evolving since January. The 5 components of this direction towards a new type of regime. The first one, the turn to surveillance and control.
A turn toward ever more intrusive forms of surveillance and control over our private choices. How we behave at home, what we wear on our faces, where we eat and drink, what substances we put into our bodies. Second, the turn to highly collectivized notions of social responsibility. The idea that individual choices affecting others must be coercively determined by public officials acting in the name of the collective, rather than left up to personal discretion and choice. Third, the heavy-handed use of censorship, mostly by private companies like Google, Twitter, and Facebook, directed at anyone who seriously questions official sources of information. Fourth, the relentless use of mass media to inculcate fear and terror in the population, softening them up for emergency measures. Fifth, the watering down or outright suspension of civil rights, allegedly to protect some public interest.
So what I'd like to ask you first is, would you change, would you add anything to that list now?
I don't think there's, at the moment, I don't think there's anything I'd add to that list. These features, these symptoms that I point to were particularly intense in 2020 and 2021. And some of these symptoms are less visible and less, let's say, salient as we speak today. Some of these measures, for example, vaccine passes, have been withdrawn in many countries, probably in most countries for now at least. But I think I'm reminded of something that Hobbes says about civil war. He says civil war is not constant battle and constant, firing, people firing on each other all the time. Civil war is the constant threat that you will be fired on. You could have 6 months go by with no one firing and still be in a civil war. And in a similar way, in a similar way for COVID, for the pandemic, and for, I would say, in particular for governments' responses to the pandemic, and this shift towards a surveillance state, towards a more controlling and intrusive state, is something that doesn't necessarily manifest itself in constant surveillance, 24-hour surveillance at every moment of the year. It's more this sense that now we have crossed a threshold in which these sorts of measures are speakable, are thinkable, and can be introduced into a conversation without shocking people. And the reason I say that we may be shifting towards a new regime is because the sorts of changes we saw during the pandemic were sufficiently radical that they put in question the basic assumptions of a liberal regime, right? So, I mean, you can have superficial changes like policies and laws that maybe some people don't like, but basically fit within the framework of liberal democracy. They respect basic liberties and rights. But we got into a political space during the pandemic in which public officials spoke quite lightly and easily about confining people to their homes, healthy people to their homes, healthy and law-abiding people to their homes. They spoke quite freely about closing churches for many, many months on end, prohibiting worship for many months on end. They spoke quite easily and freely about putting vaccine passes in restaurants and coffee shops and retail outlets, etc., etc. It was very shocking to me, and the conclusion I drew from that was that we that we may be shifting towards a new paradigm of civil order, and those features, those symptoms that I pointed to, are features of that new regime, which is basically a more dictatorial regime. It's a more top-down regime. It's a regime in which there's less room for freedom, especially for personal freedom. And I think in order for listeners to understand what I have in mind, I think it's perhaps useful to think about the Chinese Communist Party and to think about what freedom means in China and what it means to, let's just say, what type of regime they have in China, the degree of social control, population control, control over individual choice, and the degree of censorship that goes on in China. So I would say one thing about, let's just say, this idea of control over private choices. I just want to mention, I think it's really important to understand that the way liberal democracies have functioned for generations is that we trust individual citizens to do the best they can to honor their responsibilities towards their fellow citizens, not to steal, to be honest in their work, to think about public health when they act. And this is very important because it makes the regime more functional, because it requires less intervention, it's less costly, because when you trust citizens to do the right thing, you inspire them to do the right thing as well, because they feel trusted. And so during the pandemic, we made this weird shift where suddenly, against all of the public health guidelines that were in place and the pandemic protocols that were in place, we suddenly decided that citizens could not be trusted to act responsibly in the context of an infectious disease. And therefore, we needed this top-down technocratic control coercively imposed on citizens to make sure they behaved properly. A useful way to think about it is to compare the 2020 pandemic with past responses to pandemics in Western democracies. And basically, in the past, when there was an infectious disease that posed a significant threat to public health and to hospitals, what the approach that was taken was to provide citizens with counsel, with advice. So citizens were advised to reduce their social contacts. They would be advised to wash their hands. They would be advised to avoid certain kinds of very large and intense indoor social reunions, and so on. And if they were at risk, then they would be advised simply to be careful about their how they socialize, and so on. And certainly, if there was medication involved, it would be purely advisory. They would say, you could take this medication if you're sick, and so on. And so what happened then in 2019 was that we were told, essentially, that instead of advising us to be careful, to be responsible in our social behavior, and to take appropriate medication, we were ordered to stay inside our home. We were ordered, with the threat of police intervention, not to have guests in our homes. And we were ordered, with the threat of job loss or fines, or the inability to travel, to take a vaccine, to inject medication of sorts into our arm, into our body. And this is a dramatic difference. So this level of control over individual choice is completely unethical. and it's also very short-sighted because medicine is incredibly complex, and treating people for illness and preventing illness is not a one-size-fits-all endeavor. And so vaccination is a good example. Not everybody needs to be vaccinated against COVID-19. It's now well established, even though some people tried to deny this at the beginning, it's well established that people develop natural immunity, for example, when they're exposed to the disease. And now studies have shown that natural immunity actually performs better than artificial immunity induced by vaccinations. So there's no reason to ask a person who has been exposed to the virus to take a vaccine. There's no good reason to ask them, let alone to force them. So it's a paradigm change, and it was not contemplated by, for example, the WHO 2019 pandemic guidelines for flu pandemics. At in no point in that guidelines did they suggest that you could confine people to their homes involuntarily. So I hope those examples illustrate what I'm talking about.
Yes, I was thinking about a topic that I wanted to talk about later on, but I think it makes sense to introduce it now, because what you're saying is that those measures were, of course, illiberal in nature, but they were also unscientific in that the previous guidelines about how to deal with the pandemic did not imply that they would be needed. So something happened that made these measures actually applicable in a situation where they were not supposed to be applied. And I think in a presentation and also in several of your blog posts, you talked about the role played by experts. And in a way, my understanding is that experts allowed the governments to hide behind their expertise and to make these measures more palatable to the population. So maybe it's the right time to talk about them, because that's part of the explanation for why it happened.
Yes, absolutely. So first of all, I'd say that one of the important moments in the pandemic was when Professor Neil Ferguson in the United Kingdom essentially put forward projections, right? Mathematical projections. And the effect of these projections basically was to say that if strong non-pharmaceutical interventions were not used, that is to say, if the population was not locked down, if there was not a strong intervention, then up to 500,000 citizens or people could die in the space of approximately, I think, 6 months. That was the projection he made. Now, if you look at what happened in Sweden, where there was no lockdown, a fraction of that number actually we find when we look at excess mortality or COVID-related deaths, which are not exactly the same thing. But basically, if we look at either COVID-attributed deaths or excess mortality is more reliable, then we see that in Sweden, in the absence of a lockdown, only a fraction of that 500,000, correcting for population, of course, only a fraction of that amount of people died in that period that Neil Ferguson was projecting. So what can we deduce from this? We could deduce that experts contributed towards alarmism, in their projections. And governments, the UK government did a U-turn on its pandemic policies immediately after Neil Ferguson's projection. So that projection was a catalyst that pushed the UK government to reverse its policy of being kind of basically traditional approach, of being a light touch approach, advising citizens, supporting them, etc. So what happened there? what happened there was that I think in some ways experts perhaps allow themselves to be used politically, and they allowed their opinions to be, let's say, to be put to a certain use that was not appropriate, because expert opinion is often very uncertain, and it may be informed by very incomplete data. And the assumptions it makes may turn out to be false, especially in a mathematical model, right? So, I mean, if you, for example, overestimate infection fatality rates, then you're going to assume a much larger burden of mortality as a real possibility, or even as a probability. So now, on the one hand, I'd say experts, by putting forward their views with such confidence, that were often very speculative and were not properly informed, were not adequately informed. They allowed themselves to be played, and they allowed themselves, their views, to be used to legitimate very harsh and draconian social interventions. On the other hand, I'd also say that some experts, at least, did try to carefully qualify what they were saying. They did try to say that there's a lot of uncertainty about what they're saying. But I think they were somewhat politically naive about how this would be received. I mean, if you say to publicly that 500,000 citizens could die if we don't lock down, citizens are not going to pick up on the fact that this is just a possibility and it's not necessarily very probable. They're just going to think, if we don't lock down, lots of people will die. That's what they'll think. And I think the last thing I'd say about experts is that really there's a part of the problem is there's a public misunderstanding about what experts can and cannot do and what expert knowledge actually is. Expert knowledge is not like a crystal ball that you can look into and then tell people what they have to do. There are many, many intervening steps between a prediction of what might happen under certain situation or circumstances versus, say, a directive that you stay at home or that you stop working. Because the latter is a question of prudence, in which many, many variables have to be weighed, including the collateral harms to the economy and to health. And I think in some ways, the use of expert knowledge by governments was so simplistic, so reductive, because they simply presented opinions largely out of context, without acknowledging that the ultimate decision about what to do is an extremely complex prudential decision that is not decided by mathematics and is not decided by science as such. It's decided by prudence or good sense. And science is not the same as prudence or good sense. At least empirical science and mathematical science and medical science is not the same as prudence. So I think we made a jump from fairly, let's say, one-dimensional analysis that just tells us if we do X, Y might follow, to suddenly saying, therefore, you have to do X, right? When there's so many other complex variables that you have to put into the equation. And just as one example, when you say that people should isolate and stay at home, just think about the potential implications for public health of confining people to their homes. One, they do less exercise, which is good for your health. Two, they have less social contact, which actually exacerbates depression and may even induce suicidality. Three, by isolating people in their homes who are vulnerable to abuse, those people are going to be more vulnerable to abuse because they have no escape, which happened. There was a spike in abuse. And then what about people who need to work and have an income? Their income drops. And so there are all sorts of economic implications. And when people are impoverished, their health often can go down as well, according to economists. So all of these collateral harms are just brushed aside with a simplistic prediction based on limited variables. And that's what happened. There was a simplification, an oversimplification of expert knowledge.
Well, the only piece that I think might be missing is that some experts were put forward and others were violently attacked, because some experts were really strongly advising against the harsher measures because of the potential harms that they entailed, and yet they were not silenced. They were ignored and criticized. You have experts with credentials, very high H index, many publications under their name, and they were not being listened to as much as experts with much lower academic credentials, which were much more prominently featured by the media at the time. There is some sort of a mystery for me, because seniority and H index didn't seem to play a role in what kind of experts were given a voice by the media at the time.
I agree. And I think that the selective use of experts, and indeed the censorship and suppression of expert opinion that one does not like, played a big role in making it appear that there was a consensus. There was no consensus. I think that probably, certainly among those who expressed opinions, and who, let's say, were scientists or medical scientists, it's probably true that a majority of them favored harsh interventions. I think that's probably true. But there was a substantial minority of very well qualified people who were opposed to very heavy-handed interventions.
Let's turn to the other point, the second one, which is the turn to highly collectivized notions of social responsibility. So what did you mean by that? And what is some of the evidence that it happened during the pandemic time?
So an example would be under communism. So, for example, under communism, people who the communist leadership will decide what your job will be. They will allocate your job based on their idea of efficiency and justice. Okay, so they've taken that choice out of your hands and they've put it in a collective committee, right? So that they will decide where you work, how many hours you work, how much you get paid, etc. It's a simple example to illustrate what collectivization of responsibility means. Now, in the context of the pandemic, basically, this applied to various aspects of, let's say, how we conduct ourselves in order to reduce the impact of infectious disease. So previously, this was considered in the domain largely of individual responsibility. For example, how you conduct your social life, how many guests you have in your home, whether you receive this or that medication, whether you work from home remotely or work, in the office or wherever you work. All of these choices were considered to be part of personal responsibility, but suddenly they were transferred into the hands of experts who would act in the name of the collective. So the idea of collectivization is a bit of in a way, it's a euphemism, because when we say something is collective, what we really mean is that it's an elite group that will decide for the collective, for everybody. So it becomes a question of elite control of our choices. There's no such thing as a collective choice. It's rare to have a collective choice that's literally the choice of everybody. Maybe if you ran a referendum and had a vote, especially if it was a very big majority in the outcome and the result, you might be able to say it was a collective choice of the people at large. But in the context of a pandemic, when we talk about collective responsibility, when that's collectivized, what I'm referring to is when it's taken out of the hands of individual citizens and it's placed in the hands of rulers, experts, elites who will decide on behalf of everybody. And what is the problem with that? They don't see, there are two problems. One is that it basically drastically reduces the sphere of individual freedom, right? And the other problem is that it is hubristic because it assumes that these committees, these experts, will have access to the type of knowledge they need to direct individual choice. And that's that sort of knowledge they cannot have because, as certain economists like Friedrich Hayek pointed out, knowledge is dispersed. Human knowledge is widely dispersed. Like there are certain kinds of considerations that can be seen on the ground but won't be immediately seen from a high level. So depression, loneliness, for example, if somebody is sitting at home and they're feeling suicidal, they're feeling depressed, you say it's a recommendation that people reduce social contact and, if possible, stay at home. It's a recommendation. That person who's feeling suicidal will realize, I absolutely need to see someone. And maybe they'll listen to the recommendation and they'll say, you know what? My life is valuable enough in my health that I'm going to visit my friend, right? That's because they make a prudential judgment call. But imagine if they see their police that are, patrolling their neighborhood to see if they could catch people who are moving between homes or between out in the street. They might very well stay at home because they're feeling coerced to stay at home. And therefore, they're not enabled to make a good informed judgment. Their informed judgment is displaced by the uninformed judgment of an expert or a bureaucrat.
Yeah. I think this collectivized, centralized notion of social responsibility also implied strongly that those who were not acting in the socially responsible way, were openly vilified by political leaders and experts. And of course, the main area of tension was around vaccination, vaccine passports, mandatory vaccination. And in particular, I was really, and I guess many people were shocked by the strong words used against the unvaccinated by various world leaders. And I would like to remind a few of what I heard and shocked me at the time. So Justin Trudeau, which I think it was in French on Quebec TV, and he was speaking in French. Do we tolerate
à la vaccination? Qui sont extrémistes. Qui croient pas dans la science, qui sont souvent misogynes, souvent racistes aussi. C'est un petit groupe, mais qui prend de la place. Et là, il faut faire un choix en tant que leader, en tant que pays. Est-ce qu'on tolère ces gens-là?
I guess anyone who saw images from the truckers' demonstration knows that racism was not particularly present in these demonstrations. But okay, that was Trudeau. It was already very shocking. President Biden, a dark winter.
Unvaccinated, we are looking at a winter of severe illness and death for unvaccinated. For themselves, their families, and the hospitals they'll soon overwhelm.
Jacinda Ardern from New Zealand, the Prime Minister there, she was asked whether the introduction of a vaccine passport would create two unequal classes of citizens, and she proudly, matter-of-factly replied, yep, that's what it is.
So you basically said this is going to be it's almost like, you probably don't see it like this, the two different classes of people. If you're vaccinated or if you're unvaccinated, you have all these rights. If you are vaccinated...
That is what it is. So, yep.
And I kept the best for
Last.
as the last one. Yeah, the last one is my favorite because I think it is the worst. Macron, who said, and I will say it in French because all the English translations are actually euphemisms for what he actually said.
Yes, I agree.
Un irresponsable n'est pas un citoyen. Les non-vaccinés, j'ai très envie de les emmerder. Macron's statement inspired a very strong reaction from you in the form of an open letter. Could you explain how it happened and why it was important for you to write that letter?
I'd just like to, for my English-speaking listeners, I'd like to just quickly translate that in full, what he said there. So as you said...